Good afternoon all and welcome, and thank you for joining us today on our new series following up from the Preparing for Operations series, where we'll be looking at technology, economics and society, and how those three factors really play together with the world as it moves forward into the information age. Now, the program is run by our resident fellow, Dr. Louise Tomic, who is currently on her birthday today, so I've stepped in for her. And it's also my great pleasure. I asked her if I could actually just launch this series because I actually get to interview today one of my favorite authors, Jeff Booth, who is both a businessman, an entrepreneur, and also I would call a thought leader and author of what the future really looks like. And I find his book, The Price of Tomorrow, has been an absolutely influential book on my understanding and thoughts on what the world is coming fast at us and what it looks like. And so without further ado, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today. And what I'd like to do to really kick us off with is ask you what is currently wrong with the system that we live in today. I know a lot of people are not necessarily economically minded, and they kind of feel that something's not quite right with the way that our monetary system is working, the amount of debt that's being built up. All of these things seem to be problematic, but there doesn't seem to be any kind of tangible solutions, or no one seems to be talking about that. And so if you could please just explain your outline thesis of The Price of Tomorrow to the audience before we then look at other things more relevant to security and conflict, that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, first of all. So the thesis that I put forward in Price of Tomorrow and still holds today, in fact, it's reinforced in everything I see today, is the same thing you're talking about. We can all feel something that's wrong in the world, but what I felt like is everybody was missing the thing that was driving it all. So they were talking about symptoms rather than causes. And what the cause is, as far as I'm concerned, and again, everything is reinforcing that today, is you have two systems, two different systems operating against each other in diametrically opposed fashions. One system where technology is allowing prices to fall. So technology, when we use technology, we save time, and technology reduces prices as a result. And that technological advances are deflationary in nature. So they make prices fall, they save our time, they give us more for less. And so that's one system, and it's more and more powerful because of exponential, how fast technology is moving. It's moving exponentially. It's moving into all corners of all industries. So if that's true, then you would expect all prices all around us to be falling and getting cheaper and cheaper, and us having more time as a result of that happening. But what's happening to stop that is we've lived in an inflationary monetary system our whole lives. So and that's the opposite force. And it's that opposite force is because of money printing and lower interest rates and debt accumulation. And it's a credit-based system that must make prices go higher forever.
Yeah.
Or the system collapses. So you have these two forces moving in exactly opposite directions. And I understand why governments are trying to stop deflation, because the system that has been created requires inflation. And if you allow deflation, then the whole system resets. But the problem with driving inflation against a deflationary system is that you drive wealth inequality, you drive people searching for scarce resources, and essentially what you've done is corrupted money at the base layer. So you have misinformation of money at the base layer, and nobody can trust money anymore. Essentially, you're telling people that I'm trying to make your money worth less over time. And what that does is it drives a whole bunch of rational actors in a system making rational bets to try to escape that inflation in a system that's moving the other way. And it drives inequality, and it drives essentially eventually revolution and war throughout society, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean that is kind of why I think a lot of the audience will be, how does this affect me as a professional serving in the military, and how does this affect my kind of understanding of my job? And I think you nail on the head there in that, when we think about security, when we think about conflict, we need to have a real understanding, especially when we're in these transitory moments in human history, as I think we kind of could agree that we are. We're moving from a means of production of an industrialized society, and there's a whole logic trail of human interactions and how that works that are now being questioned and will start to be challenged as we start to move into an information age. And that is not never a smooth process, is it, when these things happen? But if we don't have the right mechanism, especially at the monetary level, where people's time and energy ultimately are being eroded, then it starts to atomize human decision making and trust ultimately on what people should be, trusting within the system. And that's quite a negative force, isn't it, when they've got all of these other changes happening as well?
Yeah, well, let's build on that, and because a lot of people, they tune out to economics because it sounds confusing. So I'm going to try to simplify it for a bunch of your listeners, and tie it into what we said. And then again, a whole bunch of our what we believe are rational decisions are actually decisions out of economics. We want safety, protection, be able to feed our family. And when you remove that safety, then people rise up in consequence to that. So let's just start at the top. Abundance in things creates free or nearly free, and so economics isn't about value. It's about scarcity, and that scarcity could be real or perceived. So you could create diamonds as artificial scarcity and charge a lot for diamonds, but it's really about it's about scarcity, not value. And what the information age is doing in more and more things, it's creating abundance. And I'll first start at the top and say, so people can see this. The air you breathe is free. And why? Because it's abundant. You can only charge for air underwater where it's scarce. So now let's look at some of the things in our lives that have moved from scarce to abundant, and look at the economic consequence of those things. So I'll use an example. Look at photos today. 10 years ago, Kodak and other camera companies and everything else, there was an entire distribution mechanism around. You could only take so many photos because you had to buy film and distribute the film, and then you had to go have it developed, and then it might be bad. You might have took the wrong photos. Scarcity in photos, and they cost a lot of money for that scarcity in photos. And today, you have abundance in photos. We take so many, and it's free. It's completely free. And it's you've changed an economic model around that. Now, where do those extra photos, all of that extra abundance, show up in positive GDP? And as things turn into information, GDP declines as a result. And so do jobs as a result. There are some jobs in the technology companies that are creating this, but the natural prevailing force is more for less. And now ask any rational actor. So anyone serving in the military and everything else, when they think about their own family, when they think about they think about, I'm spending my money to get more for less. Right? I'm always trying to drive more value. Why we use Google, why we use an iPhone, why we use is because they naturally give us more for less. Why we use Amazon, same thing.
Yeah.
And yet we live in a system that's trying to push the other way. So, and people actually believe, we've been conditioned to believe that inflation is a good thing. We've been conditioned, and nobody questions it. And when all inflation really is a hidden tax, and that hidden tax is put on society's most vulnerable, because because what ends up happening is the wealthy get rich through inflation because they have more assets and they have more ownership of stocks. And the poor, the other side of the coin of inflation is wage deflation. So your wages are actually going down in real terms with inflation. So a consequence of destroying money at the base layer and essentially working in opposition to a naturally path of technology, you can imagine all the consequences downstream from what we're talking about. And that's what we're seeing today, and the signposts are everywhere.
Yeah, and I mean it's I went down the kind of the rabbit hole of or trying to understand different versions of economics, especially the Austrian school, about 5 or 6 years ago as a personal investor, and I was dumbfounded by how perverse our system is for teaching Keynesian type economics. It's absolutely in the bedrock, isn't it? And it's just there's no give on could there be a different way, or is we even talk about this inflation as a good thing, and you're like, no, it's not a good thing at all, and it's clearly not a good thing as where we're going into the future. One of the things we've covered in the previous series was looking at competition itself, and I mean, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on. I can kind of see why Bretton Woods became what it did after World War One and Two, where you've got an industrial age where nations have ultimately had to borrow wealth from the future to be competitive against each other because their means of production was so upscaled because of industry that they didn't have the wealth to ultimately fight the wars at the time. And I know that's a very reductionist kind of approach to it, but what it does do is it shows the incentive for why we've kind of got where we've got, where ultimately there's been this race to borrow wealth from the future to remain competitive against other nation states, which has ultimately been this race to the bottom in this kind of currency devaluation, inflationary model, as we see and as you've talked about. I just wonder, what are your thoughts on how that rationale plays out in the information age? Because we're kind of at the bottom of that race now. There's not that much more we can borrow from the future. It's time to start paying now, really, isn't it? And it's kind of, where does the petrodollar, and this is one of the thought experiments I'm playing with at the moment, is that the petrodollar is the kind of manifestation of this paradox we've been in. Does that give way to this carbon credit system where that's the new version in the information age? It's all about accounting for everything via tokenization, and you can kind of see the carbon credit piece being an atomization attack vector on other nation states or other competitors within the system, rather than using the ability to borrow from the future. So it's trying to work out how the new system gets weaponized ultimately, I think.
Yeah, and let's just say these are really complex topics and everything else. So I'm going to try to do it justice and simplify it at the same time. But for all your listeners at the same time, remember this as a primary in all their thinking. You're measuring a system. You're measuring a system from the system, and that system is going through a once in a generation shift, maybe even once in ever shift to a new system. So you're moving from an inflationary system. And why I use this example is in my book, I wrote about $250 trillion of debt for $80 trillion of GDP. And that sounds like an enormous amount. And that was 2 years ago. It's way higher than that today, amount of debt to GDP. And you'd think, okay, could I ever pay that debt back? Now, remember, especially moving into the information age where things are negative GDP as they turn to information. So the debt is unpayable. So why you have monetization of debt, essentially printing money and pretending that money has value, is because the debt is unpayable. But bigger than that is 185 trillion of that debt came in the last 20 years. And so you have $250 trillion of debt, and 185 trillion came within the last 20 years. Exactly as you would predict if technology started to make more of an impact on our lives and you had to offset it. But nobody asked the question, how much would my house be without $185 trillion? They think housing goes up forever. They think prices go up forever. But they fail to ask the question, would my house go up forever? Would pricing go up like it has without $185 trillion of spending over the last 20 years? And so if you believe that 185 trillion can happen over the next 20 years, and then more and more, or over the next 10 years, it has to be more and more, then housing will continue to go up. But what you can see is you're really, essentially, you're manufacturing money, you're making up money, which is destroying all the market. It's just a lottery, and people are caught in that, measuring a system. So now go into your other question: how did this happen? How did so after World War II, so that this wouldn't happen again, because this is the lead up to World War I, as currencies and everything else, everybody had their own currency, and they were manipulating currency to be able to drive world trade. And so leading up to World War II, Bretton Woods tied to gold, US dollar tied to gold, that essentially governments had to keep their spending in check. And there was a system built around the world. But what ended up happening is US couldn't pay their bills out of the Vietnam Wars. Taxes were over 90% in the US in the 60s.
Wow, that's crazy, isn't it? Imagine a 90% tax.
But people don't realize most of governments that they say that is about tax, most of their spending comes through inflation, a hidden tax that's delivered on the most vulnerable, because it's inflation, again, is lower savings, lower wages. So it's delivered on the people without assets. And so most of the tax revenue comes from inflation. So again, U.S. had over 90% tax in the 60s. Vietnam War, that they couldn't pay for it. France demanded the gold back, and U.S. went on the gold reserve. And Bretton Woods effectively ended at that time. And so now you had a monetary policy around the world pegged to the U.S. dollar. And what the U.S. did at that time is really which is again rational, because if a country controls a currency that's worked around the world or uses it around the world, domestic issues always take priority over foreign ones.
Yeah. Okay.
So what ends up happening is U.S. exports their problem all around the world, and their citizens don't see it as much, and they're able to drive inflation and through the 70s, and cause less pain for their citizens, more pain elsewhere.
Jeff, I mean, it's basically a heat sink of the laws of thermodynamics, ultimately, isn't it? But on a global scale.
On a global scale. Now, carry that on. That game would have ended. It would have gotten a lot worse then. But then the petrodollar system essentially gave that game a longer way to play. So if you could have your oil price, if global oil was priced in US dollars, essentially it acted as gold, and you were able to do it again. That game is running out. It's run its course, and two things are driving it. Technology. More of the world is moving to solar, lower cost energy for different. And there's other nation states that are pricing, like China, that are pricing oil and yuan or euros and demanding this to happen, which is creating a competitive devaluation of currencies around the world. Yeah. So and that has to continue, because you have global trade. Global trade has to. So let's use a real example. If China, so for a while, China becomes the manufacturing hub of the world, and U.S. is a buying hub of the world. But there can be no buyers without sellers. There can be no sellers without buyers. The world trade, essentially globally, it has to equal zero. It's a zero-sum game around the world. Yeah. And so if China says, I'm going to buy US bonds to keep interest rates low, so buyers can buy a whole bunch of my stuff, it acts like in a business, like a vendor financing. Right, so for a long time until 2013, that's what China was doing, buying U.S. bonds, Treasury bonds, keeping interest rates low, and China and U.S. was buying a whole bunch more of China's goods. Well, China's labor rate should have gone up, but they were manipulating their labor rate down, because if their labor rate went up, they wouldn't be the manufacturer anymore. So they were manipulating labor rate down to because that was a key driver of their, and U.S. is fighting that. So U.S. is trying to manipulate their labor rate down, so it becomes currency devaluation. And then China says, okay, well, I'm not going to buy the bonds anymore because I know what you're going to do. You're going to pay me back in cheaper dollars. You have. So why would I buy bonds? So what will I buy? I'll buy rare earth mines. I'll buy physical things that are needed in the transition to so China, I think, has 90% of global production of rare earth minerals, which is a key enabler for the transition to a digital future. Yeah. And now you start getting geopolitical risks out of this, because what ends up happening inside societies is, to get elected, you have to convince a population that somebody is bad. That person is hurting you, and I'm going to provide a better path. But once you're elected, you need to create a greater enemy outside your state, and that's what you're seeing. You're starting to see that happen all over the world today.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of the for me anyway, is a fairly large concern, where we even see it in our kind of our lexicon and the wording we're using now. You know, we're entering this period of constant competition. We're also seeing this pluralization of security issues. I mean, everything's becoming a security issue, and you just think, you know, you've got to follow that logical path to its conclusion and realize it's probably not a good end state. We need to have a little bit of discipline in how we approach some of these issues, and ultimately I think a lot of things will become security issues, just as we start to see this kind of integration of different issues through digitization, etc. But it's interesting, as we go through our integrated review in the British defense system at the moment, that is clearly one of the logical playouts as it's happening now. I want to just tail back to one of the things you mentioned, which I think is really interesting, and kind of leads us on to potentially just to talk about centralization and decentralization as we enter the information age. And I think what would be quite interesting to get your thoughts on is kind of the juxtaposition between how, since the end of the Cold War, certainly we've seen the kind of the canary in the cage of units of human activity breaking down into more economically viable actors, and that, you know, there's kind of, we see this through ultimately the end of communism and the Soviet Union as an uneconomically viable enterprise, but we also see it in the Balkans, the Middle East, most of Africa. You know, you could argue Brexit is part of this meta trend where, you know, is the EU actually an economically viable institution, and will we now start to see it start to fragment as people try to find economic viability as the unit of account reduces? And so that's kind of a meta trend for decentralization as we enter the information age, and I think, you know, Africa has seen that hugely, especially even during the Cold War, where you saw artificial boundaries, colonial boundaries put on areas of land, and then ultimately tribal groups within that realize, well, why am I subsidizing other elements of this country which don't make sense? And so you start to see, you know, even South Sudan and stuff like that. And so that's now not just a kind of a third world issue of the Cold War or colonialism. I'd argue that's now something that's probably going to manifest itself across surprising traditionally stable bodies of organization. I mean, you can even see it, I think, a little bit with Texas and Miami. They're both looking, you know, and even California looking a little bit of like, well, actually, we could probably go it alone here and be better off. Versus, sorry, that's quite a long preamble. So that decentralization piece of that economic viability versus the kind of the centralizing powers of which I think you talk brilliantly about in your book about, you know, AI being the kind of the big one. It's the winner takes all technology, really, isn't it? No one wants the second best AI algorithm on their side. And it's just how do you see those two kind of meta trends playing against each other? And like, where do you see the riptide being?
So I'm going to connect this to something you asked before, to like a carbon credit, and that being the next kind of war ground for.
Yeah.
That carbon credit is within the existing system.
Okay.
So people are confused, and that's what I'm getting at. If you keep the highest level and then work down.
Okay.
Technology is deflationary, and that means the world must have a digitally native currency that allows for deflation, or 100% centralization through inflation.
Wow.
And,
yeah, when you follow it to its logical, those are the two kind of choices, aren't they?
And that's why that's such an important path, because people are making decisions inside a system that and they're getting confused inside that system, but that system must continue to centralize. Because today in Canada, 26% of GDP is government spending. At the turn, it used to be 1%. And so the more spending, and you talked about communism, the more centrally controlled a society is, the less benefit its citizens have. You're removing individual rights and freedoms and concentrating on the state, and because the state knows better. What does the state do? And then all of the repercussions of that. Well, we need a stronger military to hold our citizens in check. We need this, because all of that comes from more and more centralization, more and more, and a path of essentially very few humans with domain over all other humans.
Yeah.
And that path, we are save something, and when we'll talk about Bitcoin, save something that can allow that transitionary path. The system can't change itself. So the system has always, throughout time, when we get to this point in a cycle, has always gone to war, reset, and then said to governments, "We promise we won't do it next time."
Yeah.
and
that's through human history, isn't it? It's just littered with that.
You look back through all of human history, and you find the same thing, always going back to changing money supply. And then it happening again and happening again, and so you get these times of peace, and then a build up, and we're at that cycle right now. The difference with the cycle today is technology is made it move faster and faster and faster, and technology is moving the other way. We had that cycle in the kind of turn of this in 1900s, electrification of society, and same deflationary force, which caused a bunch of this as things got cheaper and more efficient. You could do more for less, but nothing like what's coming. Most of the deflation is in front of us because of what you just said, artificial intelligence and everything else. So now think about human beings and how we all act, not how we want other people to act, how we all act. And when you look at through that lens of history, you wonder, why don't more people stand up? Like in Russia today, why don't more people stand up? The government would be toppled in an instant if 5% of the population stood up. But because very few people stand up, if you Navalny today, they can be hurt by the state or taken away power by the state and everything else, and marginalized, and not enough people, and most people seek safety in that system. So they hide in safety instead of standing up, and it might be a rational thing to do. So very few people are willing to stand up against that type of power. Now imagine this: where we're going, we're going to have artificial intelligence as having a super intelligence. Imagine all power being concentrated with robotics and AI in the hands of very few people that could change their minds. over domain over everyone else. That is the world of centralization. That, in fact, I wrote the book because I looked at my kids and I said, the world requires a different monetary policy for an abundant future. It requires a different monetary policy for my kids to thrive and the world to thrive. And that is the path we're on. But people will give up their sovereignty without knowing that they've given up their sovereignty on this path for safety and everything else. The entire climate debate is actually not, so inflation causes climate change. Inflation is climate change. And I'll show you why. Today, solar and batteries and everything else is now lower cost than most other energy. So you have energy that's getting cheaper at about 11% a year. That's moving into more and more industries and can actually decentralize centralized power grids to actually right to the home.
Yeah.
And essentially, at some point, that could be free energy. But so you have new energy coming in at lower cost than all of the other energy, and it's becoming more and more a deflationary force, and everything else on top of energy, and energy is primary in everything else we do. So that must mean more deflation in the future. Yeah. But if your existing system requires inflation to be able to survive, what do? You have to destroy it. You have to create more money to essentially make oil prices go up, make people work more, cause people to work 2 jobs, 2.5 jobs to be able to pay for things that are artificially going up in price, to drive to work and everything else, to have this almost make-believe economy, which means inflation equals climate change.
Yeah.
And yet people are confused, and they think, and they're granting government more power to create more inflation to be able to try to stop the thing that government is causing with inflation.
Yeah, and I mean it's also the fact that you're because you're stealing this wealth from the future. It's not sustainable. It's you're not. How on earth can you have a sustainable system where you're kept honest and true, and you live within your means, and all of the hype and rhetoric we see from the kind of the green movement, when you are just constantly clawing forward as a privileged, and I'm talking more, I suppose, of the kind of those that have got access to the cheap credit, the cheap ability to claw forward all of this wealth and use it now. So yeah, for me it makes perfect sense.
You have BlackRock right now, the largest asset manager in the world, that actually gets free money effectively from the government, competing in the US to buy homes with citizens, and competing because the homes go up in price, the rents go up in price, and a whole bunch of the citizens that can't afford those homes essentially can't pay for those homes. So in a society like that, where the rich are getting richer and richer and empowered to do so, you can expect, but here's the problem. What most people will do, because they don't understand the system change, what most people do will go back to the same government to say, or a different government, or somebody else that says it's those people's fault that you're poor, and I'm going to fix it. But the people that are fixing it are going to print more money to be able to make it worse. So pick one pocket to be able to hand it out of the other pocket, because it's a system problem. It's not a people problem. And so while you have inflation at the core of the system, which is really based on a theft against the natural laws of where technology is going, then nobody in power can change that system. They keep on feeding it, because if you allow that to fail, everything stops. Now, so that requires something, and I look at business examples to provide this. Kodak, even though they invented the digital camera,
yes, that's right, yeah,
drove their existing system because they couldn't see we have to do something different, even though the technology that we invented creates the system change. So they drove themselves right off a cliff by doing the same thing. We have to sell film, we have to sell film, we have to sell film. And it's easy to laugh at Kodak Blockbuster, who did the same, or
Yeah.
that it happens in business all the time. Creative destruction, where an industry can't see the technology change that allows a betterment of society, people to change without all the cost, so they protect their cost. That's what's happening in global currencies today, and that's what's happening in global governments today. They're protecting this at all costs, and so in any type of system change like that, you realize that the system can't change itself. Kodak can't change itself because they had the embedded cost of the entire distribution, everything else, built a different type of distribution system, and the technology changed that. They would have had to completely reinvent what their company stood for, be Instagram or Facebook, which people they don't have the pattern recognition in their own minds to be able to understand. That's what's happening today. And so what that means is system change typically comes from the outside in, and is a forcing function on the existing system. And if you look through the lens of, and that's a good thing for humanity. Because it provides a path to get from one system to another system. And if the path happens at a rate that's a reasonable time, then a whole bunch of society can move to that new path faster, and provide a transition to a new system. So, like I said, at the highest level, where we're going in the future, if you don't want all control owned by a very few number of people in the world, then you must have a digitally native currency that allows for deflation. That's what a Bitcoin is.
Yeah.
And what you're seeing is very early what Bitcoin is that's providing that path. It's really early. It's going to be upwardly volatile. It's going to, but that is what I believe that path is.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I without orange pilling too many people on within the army, which I'll be happy to do. I think I very much came across Bitcoin as an investor, something to make money, or to monetary gain out of, and I think that's one of its lines of persuasion. But I agree with you, Jeff, that I'm very much, and probably within about even 3 years ago, changed my outlook from a financial gaining perspective to one of, this is a philosophical stroke political kind of stance, in that it's the only technology I can kind of see that has a drift bias that is decentralizing. So it's inherently in its DNA, a kind of, at the moment, and it's played out over the last 12 years as a decentralizing force. And I think when you look at all of this centralization that's happening, especially with AI, I mean, that's got to be a good thing, right? Is to be able to have a monetary account of our life force, our energy, a trustless system that is then also, as people buy into it as an open system, then also starts to gain in strength, but also decentralize. I think it's incredible, really. It's an incredible piece of technology, and it's almost kind of a singularity between time, energy, and trust, which we've just never seen before. We're still poking at it with a stick, trying to work out what it is. And some people get it for all different types of reasons, but as a Schelling point between all of those things, it's immensely powerful.
It may be, in retrospect, no one will say it today, just like they wouldn't have said the printing press was a great invention in the time of the printing press.
Yes. Yeah.
But the printing press gave way for human information to be written information to be codified, and it gave way for error correction on that information.
Yeah.
So a whole bunch of new minds could contribute to world knowledge, and then error corrected, scientific method, everything else came on top of that. And so error correction is at the heart of human intelligence. Error correction actually is human intelligence.
I love that. I love that definition. I think it's just it's so apt and so simple and elegant, isn't it? But it just captures everything so well.
And again, I wrote that in the book, but if you see what you do, right, the people that practice anything, they're error correcting themselves and everything else. So things turn into a subconscious ability and they can zone out to something else. And it doesn't matter what that it's in. But the problem with human time is we don't have enough time to do that in all of the different fields. But artificial intelligence is just moving that error correction into computers, and it's happening faster. So every technology creates more information. And then, so you could use the printing press, more information. And then there's a whole bunch of misinformation in that technology too. So imagine the churches used printing presses first to drive their, and then other people used it and error corrected some of the information around the churches, that knowledge. And the world, so the drive for humanity advanced through hope and technology of that and contributing to error correction through that. So every technology creates more information, and the technology also solves error correction in that in time. So today we have a technology, the internet, creating massive amounts of more information.
Yeah.
And you could argue that there's a ton of misinformation in that as well. One quick thing, if you have misinformation in money, then you must have misinformation everywhere else.
Yeah.
So,
it
but
just
there's a lot,
extrapolates out, doesn't it?
extrapolates out everything else. But you have a lot of misinformation everywhere else. But artificial intelligence is also error correcting at a scale that we've never seen before. So that's where that's going. And now, if you tie that into Bitcoin, you must have. So technology also. I can't think of a time in history where a technology that empowered individual rights and freedoms and humanity was stopped by government, ever, ever. So that's what you have in Bitcoin. You have a technology that's an empowerment of individual rights and freedoms. You have a technology that might be in the future looked at as humanity's greatest invention, because it allowed a lot of these other things to be corrected and restore human time, give you back your time, because what's happening is, if you print money against the natural force of technology, you rob our time. Essentially your trade of the things you do for money is a trade of your time for money. And if a government is destroying that trade, you can imagine that's going to cause a whole bunch of downstream consequences.
Yeah, I think one of my concerns has been that clearly we're due a monetary reset. It's something that happens every 45 to 50 years on this kind of cyclical nature. But it's also the fact that when we've got so much that's being front loaded into the digital space, and we know that it's here to stay, then as you say, actually finding some means of scarcity or collateral or a unit of an account to be able to say, okay, well, what value does this prescribe? And again, it's not falling down the trap of trying to assign value, but trying to understand the scarcity of something. And so when everything you can replicate in the digital realm, all the photos, all of this stuff becomes ultimately worthless, to then have a digital asset that is scarce and is, at the moment, and I can't see this changing because it's had 10 years of network effects or 12 years of network effects, having something that has the ability to remain scarce, an absolute scarcity on a projected scale out. I mean, it's so powerful, and it means that everything that we build for the future of humanity on top of that can have an account. You can take account of what value should be in on a global setting as well. And I fear that no one really understands exponential growth, and at the moment the systems work for the West because there are systems, we put them in place at the end of World War II and so forth and etc. But they work they work for a finite time on that exponential curve until they don't work. And we've seen El Salvador take the brave step of being like, right, we're going for it because there's a necessity. And it's that outside change, isn't it, where they're like, well, actually the system isn't working for us, so we're going to choose a new system. And that just has such the prisoner dilemma when that kicks in at the nation state level on a new monetary system. You have a run on the banks ultimately, don't you? You have a run on the old system, and policymakers in the current system where that works for us, i.e. the US and the UK, etc., they miss the timing on that. They just miss it so badly. And actually, we I suppose the meek do inherit the earth. I mean, it's
so here's an interesting thing, and for Bitcoin, I'm sure there's a whole bunch of people that are listening to this that are scared of Bitcoin, haven't understood it, and everything else. And you're really deep on it. I'm really deep on it, and I'm deep on it from a understanding both systems, how they work, and everything else. And I've gone down every path, so I can easily have conviction in something like that, whereas it might be scary for somebody else. And just saying the word might tune out a whole bunch of people. And it's really important that doesn't happen, because Bitcoin, anybody could get any amount of it today and protect, if I'm right, if you're right, protect their future in a way that could never be protected in the past. And so it's a really important technology. It's one at least worth understanding at the depth and doing some real research on why you might want to be a part of this. The other thing that's really important as well is any technological change, in Bitcoin included, must be misunderstood by the majority to have an asymmetric bet, to have almost unlimited upside and limited downside. It must have. So
that's the kind of the principles of investment, isn't it? Really,
it's principle. If you think about Amazon in 2001, when it dropped from $115 to $5, and the world said it's going to go broke and everything else. So what a joke! And Walmart and everybody else and everything else. And today it's $2,700.
Yeah.
But again, same thing they were doing then, same thing they're doing now, a different system change and a network effect that's moving. A lot of people misunderstood it, what it was at that point.
Yeah.
Bitcoin is actually more powerful than that. And why I say it's more powerful than that, it's like being able to invest in the internet itself. So it's Bitcoin is like the TCP IP layer of the internet, and most of the value on top of the internet was extracted by the companies on top of the network effect that added value. Bitcoin itself is like it being able to invest in the internet itself, and that's a really rare opportunity. You talked about for you too, that it first came for your ability for money, and then later on you realized it helps a system change, and it helps kind of humanity move from one system that will not work to a system that can. And so that's more why I'm in it and everything else. But it's just important for people to know, because there's so much hype and everything else, and so much people taking sides without really understanding at its core why. And so it's important for people to really understand.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I was wondering if we move on to kind of we spoke about thresholds and risks in our previous series as well. Again, very focused on nation state against nation state. And yes, we kind of explored looking at a kind of a multi-domain aspect of how different thresholds can start to interact with each other. So whether it be cyber, linked to physical events on the ground, or a hacking event, and we're still kind of in the foothills as most defense forces are, trying to understand what are the new rules, what the new etiquettes for nations to kind of engage each other on those frontages, and what can we kind of get away with. But I was just wondering, is it worth talking about how that might be a bit misleading, in that actually what we should really be thinking about when we're looking at these thresholds and the risks moving forward is that the social upheaval from all of this economic churning that's going to happen from technology, from all of this kind of stuff, is probably more important than state on state action. And I can't help but be reminded of, Yuval Harari's book Homo Deus, where I think there's a very stark point in there that kind of adds to what you're saying, where he says, electricity and automation kind of gets rid of our our mechanical abilities as a species, and AI almost gets rid of our cognition piece, and you end up with hundreds of millions of useless people. What do you do with all these people? And it's quite he kind of just leaves it there in the book, but it's just quite stark, isn't it? I mean, how does that play out, and how do we address that really, and kind of confront it from a kind of security but also humanity perspective?
So this is all connected, and it's moving faster and faster all the time, and it's really important. This is actually why we need a system change, because on one ideologue, you would say, so let's just assume artificial intelligence, or people could look deeper into this, but I'm at the forefront of this in a whole bunch of different industries. Artificial intelligence, it's very difficult to say that's going to be net positive jobs globally. It has to be, because if a computer, we pay somebody that's a fraction better than everybody else a ton more, like in a free market, right? So
it's winner take all, isn't it? Yeah,
take all. And now you're having artificial intelligence that's 100 times better than us in individual things. And so, and as that generalizes and it moves into more and more domains and everything else, so again, artificial intelligence is error correction at scale, and first it needs training from us to be able to become better and better, but then it doesn't need us. So in that world, and I know that a lot of people will say, put up a fear response and say it can't happen here, but let's just play with that as a thought experiment and say, what if it does? Let's just imagine a world, because I think it will for sure. And then the other mistake people are making because of that fear, they're saying it's going to be a light switch moment. And one day artificial intelligence is going to not be here, and the next day it's here everywhere. And that's not the way it looks. It looks like a path to take more and more jobs all the way through. And so that more and more jobs all the way through, as it does that, is diametrically opposed to a world where you have to create more and more jobs by making those jobs. So inflation is wage deflation. So making people get paid less for those jobs globally. So those are two diametrically opposed. So you have a future where you have less jobs, and you have a system that requires you manipulating money to make labor cheaper to be able to create more jobs. And now look at, why don't we dig holes with spoons? We could get rid of all the excavators and dig holes with spoons to have more jobs. Why don't we? Because technology saves our time. So why wouldn't we do the same thing here, and have a system where as the jobs came out, the prices fell at a natural order? And when I use that oxygen example, that air example, the more jobs that are removed, the faster prices fall as a result. And that's a system that we must have to enable where we're moving in technology. And we must, because every other system says the opposite. Every other system says, I'm going to have all the money so I can take care of those millions of people without jobs, but I'm going to keep the prices really high. I'm going to force prices high so people have to rely on me to give them money. So I'm in domain over those other people. Those are the two different systems. And if more people understood that, more people would be racing into Bitcoin as fast as they could and protecting that system, because it is a system that that forces the abundance gained from technology into the broadest possible hands.
Yeah. No, that I mean that's really interesting, and it's luckily I think that there are so many hooks to it that people will ultimately, when it's mother of invention isn't a necessity, people will start to see and be able to protect their stuff and be able to kind of bring themselves in alignment with the forces that are invisible to a large degree that are affecting them. And so Jeff, I think I have no idea how fast the time has just gone. It's just flown by. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I'm going to have to unfortunately bring it to an end here. And I really don't want to, because I've really enjoyed that. That has been a fantastic insight into your time, and thank you so much for giving us your time and your expertise on this subject. It's interesting because we need to focus on developing our wider conceptual component in the military and not just be so stovepiped on, what's a security issue, what's this. We need to understand the holistic approach of these things, and sometimes it's more than just looking at Russia and China. And I think some of the issues we've talked there about the decentralization, the inflationary aspect of it, and also changes that are ultimately going to come. I mean, I think for the Bitcoin piece, it happens. It's just a matter of when, because ultimately it's a bit like in the UK, we had the grey squirrel introduced into the country, and it was just a matter of time until the grey squirrel then destroyed the red squirrel, because it's a superior squirrel. It's just it's a thing. And no matter how much effort we've put into trying to stop this movement of the grey squirrel up the country, it's happened, because it's an open system that's superior and is going to eat the other system ultimately. And so yeah, just really fascinating to hear you talk today, Jeff. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And it would be great to get you on later on in the year, if that's possible, on maybe potentially some form of panel debate, where we look at climate change and also some of the other technological aspects as the series builds out. And I think we're going to be looking, Louise is going to be looking at drones, she's going to be looking at cyber technology, and then also some kind of socio-economic stuff. And I think she's got one of the research heads in from Investec to look at ESG movement, etc. So I think it'll be really interesting to just get a really wide discussion from a broad-minded panel.
Would love to.
Brilliant, Jeff. Thank you so much for your time today. And I know there's quite a large time difference as well. So thank you for getting. I can see the sun starting to rise in the background there now. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Cheers.